We began to touch on the subject of death and the afterlife at the end of last week's lesson, because since about the 4th century AD, you see, Christianity has worked kind of backwards by taking what was revealed in the New Testament and then trying to read it backwards into the Old Testament. We tend then to read some of the Old Testament writings and say that the words they used were referring to heaven or to hell, even though those actual words weren't employed. Any good Jewish scholar can tell you that's not the case, that what it says is what they meant, and that the concept of a man going up to heaven to be with God or descending to a place where the devil resided was not envisioned to the inspired writers of the Hebrew Bible. Now, certainly we see the concepts of death and the afterlife evolve as we progress through the Old Testament, but we never will find an explicit thought of a man dwelling in heaven in God's presence. Now, as scattered and as uneven as this subject is, particularly in the Old Testament, in general, one could say that death revolved around Sheol. And from an Old Testament perspective, Sheol was not Hades, it was not hell, but it certainly wasn't a desirable place to be either, even though it was inevitable for everybody. Rather, it was the common place that every human could expect to visit, the grave. Whether wicked or good, Israelite or heathen, Sheol was the end of physical existence. And for the most part, there was a very hazy, undefined sense of an afterlife in an underworld that was thought to exist. Undoubtedly, this was a holdover from Israel's 4 centuries in Egypt, where there was a highly evolved and practiced doctrine of death and the underworld and the spirits of the dead, and even a kind of resurrection that was similar to, but not identical to, the concept of reincarnation. The entire purpose of those fabulous pyramids had to do with making the spirits, or the afterlife, of the departed kings and queens or aristocrats very comfortable and safe. Ancestor worship played a significant role in practically every known culture of the world in the Bible era. Ancestor worship isn't necessarily as it sounds. It didn't always involve worship. Sometimes it was honoring spirits of the dead out of an obligation to do so. That's because you wanted them to do it for you when you died. In other cases, there was a kind of worship in that it was thought that a dead person's spirit was in close contact with the god of the underworld. And perhaps you could ask your ancestor's spirit to get this underworld god to do something for you. We know for sure that the ancient Hebrews incorporated ancestor worship in their death cult and in their afterlife beliefs. We find reference to it in many passages in the Bible, especially as it pertains to Jacob and to Joseph, insisting that they be buried outside of Egypt with their ancestors so that they could continue to commune with them in the afterlife. But by no means was the biblical literature on death and afterlife in the mold of Egyptian theology. Death was a negative for the Hebrews. Whatever vague sense of life after death that was contemplated was negative. Physical life was the best. It was the highest form of existence for a human. Death was just an unpleasant fact. Living a long life, a full lifespan, that was the blessing. Going to the grave early was called, in general, being cut off, particularly if one was seen as wicked or maybe having trespassed against God. Just as Sheol is the fulcrum of the Hebrews' thoughts on death, the term shades is the generic term for whatever form of it exists, if any, that a human assumes upon his death. In general, though, the most pleasant prospect of death was to sleep with one's ancestors. Now, that's a phrase that's been hotly debated. The accepted thought is that whatever happens in the grave, to sleep with one's ancestors generally meant that somebody was in a peaceful state, as opposed to being in a state of perpetual anxiety or torment. Now, in Jesus' day, not only had the idea of a place where the spirits of the dead existed come into vogue, spirits waiting for something, probably judgment, but the concept of bodily resurrection was also a hot religious topic of his day. Some, like the Sadducees, said no to bodily resurrection, while others, like most sects of the Pharisees, said yes to the possibility of bodily resurrection. But even the concept of bodily resurrection wasn't what we think of it now. That is, that our spirits are either in hell or with God, and then our physical bodies are resurrected and we go to a spiritual place, heaven, if we were believers for further existence. Instead, the Jews of Jesus' day, for centuries before, and in many cases it remained so, for them, resurrection of the dead was most often only a metaphor for the restoration, if you would, of an apostate and of an apostate Israel, a subjugated Israel at times. It did not mean to literally have a dead person come back to life in a better body. For some in that era, it meant that after Israel had been purified by the Lord and made the dominant nation on earth as God's kingdom, then perhaps those who died as righteous members of the great perpetual kingdom were brought back to life, a physical, earthly life in this restored and purified kingdom of God, Israel. Certainly they had never been at any point up in God's heaven. So the concept proposed by Yeshua and then expanded upon by Paul of believers living eternally in the presence of God in heaven in a higher spiritual plane, this was new. The Jews indeed believed in a world to come, in Hebrew, olam haba. But generally, it looked a lot more like the widely accepted Christian view of the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Because that takes place physically on earth, not in heaven. Though different Jewish sects believed differently, the thought generally was that a new golden age for Israel was at hand, the world to come, the olam haba, in which Israel would be the preeminent world power, and Israel, governed by God, would finally take its rightful place as a godly kingdom that governed the whole earth. The entire world would, in essence, convert to Judaism and follow the Torah perfectly. That was what was in their minds. But the thought that the spirit of a man could live in God's heavenly dwelling place was not there till the advent of Yeshua. In fact, the idea that a man, whom at best is so impure and unrighteous and sinful, could be allowed into God's heaven, and his very presence would be there, was anywhere from laughable to blasphemous. They just couldn't accept that. And of course, that concept was forthrightly rejected by the bulk of the most learned Jews. The least learned Jews, the peasants, now they were more open to this idea. Therefore, it was the common folk who came to Christ in droves, and the highly educated who, but for a handful, shunned him. The bottom line as concerns our study of Leviticus is that whether ghosts existed or not, one was not trying to have contact. One was not to try to have contact with them. And most Israelites believed, by the way, that they did exist. Nor was one to have anything to do with someone who did the contacting of the dead as a paying profession. That was a major no-no. My best take on this is that God was not saying that the spirits of the dead, of dead people, could actually be contacted. Rather, it was an unclean, unholy thing to be dealing with such matters, and only unholy people would even try it. The dead are dead, and death is an abomination to God. The spirits of the dead exist somewhere, but in the scriptures, it's only the heathen who try to consort with these spirits, a living being communicating with a dead being. But the attitude towards attempting to commune with the spirits of the dead is akin to idol worship, the worshiping of false gods. First and foremost, they're not real. These gods don't exist in the first place. The Bible will at times call them false gods, lo Elohim, non-gods. And really, what the spirit mediums are sometimes consorting with or worshiping are demons that lie. And they claim to be the spirit of a dead person that somebody's trying to contact. Because then they can influence that person. They can deceive that person at the behest of their boss, Satan. There is utterly no doubt that anyone can, hear me, anybody can contact and consort with a demon. And we get Old Testament and New Testament examples of that exact thing. Go back to Leviticus 19. In Leviticus 19, verse 32, God instructs that Israel should respect the elderly. This is not ancestor worship, nor does it mean that the oldest living member of the household is necessarily dominant in an authority. It means to honor them, usually by taking care of them and seeing to their needs, because at this point in life, they're not physically able to care for themselves. But it also means that the wisdom that the elderly have gained ought to be put to good use. It ought to be appreciated, not ignored. Next, we have another command that actually won't even have any meaning to the Hebrews for about 4 decades. Don't wrong a stranger, ger, G-E-R, ger, that lives with you in your land, the land, of course, being the land of Canaan. This theme of a duty to treat foreigners fairly and to even allow those foreigners who want to give up their heathen gods and make the God of Israel their God, that they be welcome new members of the nation of Israel. This is repeated time after time. To join Israel in the time of Yeshua forward meant to join Israel more in a spiritual sense, not a physical sense. So there was a big change. To join in the covenants made between God and Israel, you had to accept Yeshua. You had to be grafted in. To join in the heavenly ideal of Israel, a nation of people devoted to Jehovah, we get the formula for it in Romans 11. And Paul explains how Gentiles who have faith in Christ are grafted in to Israel. It's a term we talk about all the time as Christians. But it's still in a spiritual, not a physical sense. Alongside Israel not in place of Israel, as the younger brother of Israel, not suddenly Israel's elder. Not only that, but the reason Israel is to do this, to accept a foreigner who wants to accept the God of Israel, is yet another admonition by God to love him, that neighbor, as you love yourself. We've heard that before. And Israel shouldn't have a hard time identifying with a foreigner who wants to be among them because, as it says at the end of Leviticus 19, verse 34, because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. So you ought to understand this. And part of the reason for the Egyptian experience was to learn some valuable lessons. And one of those lessons was, these foreigners are valuable in God's eyes. He loves them. So you're to love them. Verses 35 and 36 tell the Israelites they're not to cheat one another, or should they cheat foreigners in doing business. That's a little bit different from what Islam says, isn't it? Islam says if you're not a Muslim, take every advantage that you can, deceive, lie, kill, steal from them. It's not really stealing. Matter of fact, that'll earn you a trip to heaven. So the next time somebody tells you Islam's just like Judeo-Christianity, it's all the same, walk away. Again, as I mentioned over time, more than once, it remains even just the Middle Eastern culture to cheat and to bribe and whatever it takes to win in a business transaction. The best and most revered businessmen, in fact, in the Middle East are the cleverest, because they can cheat the best, get away with it. God's people are to emulate God, be fair and be just to everybody. Now, this chapter ends with God's reminder to follow all of his laws and commandments, not just the convenient ones. So let's move on to Leviticus chapter 20. Now, that's going to continue with God's lesson in holiness to the general population of Israel. The thing we should notice is that in the previous chapters, particularly chapters 18 and 19, God laid down a whole series of rules and ordinances that basically said, don't do this as the pagans do. Instead, do something else. Now in chapter 20, God backs up and says, but if you do any of these forbidden things I've told you not to do, then this is what's going to happen to you. In other words, the penalty for violation of God's commandments is more the point of chapter 20. And just as in modern civil society, where we can determine the level of seriousness that a particular culture assigns to a particular moral failure by means of the nature and severity of the punishment that's meted out for it, so we can see which crimes against God that he sees as most offensive to him. And we can see this according to the severity of penalties that he prescribes for each of these trespasses. And as we read chapter 20, the general structure is going to be that we will move from the most serious trespasses against God, which requires the violator to forfeit his life, to the level just under that, in which a person is cut off by some means. Now, please keep in mind that every violation listed in chapter 20 is a very serious one. Even sins of the slightly lower level of violations in which one is cut off are at times called aberrant to God. In modern day legal thought, then, we would say, every one of these moral failures are serious felonies. The issue is analogous to whether a crime is going to be a capital offense, or maybe you'll just suffer in prison a long time, maybe up to life. That's the dividing line. So pull out your Bibles, open them to Leviticus chapter 20, and we're going to read it all. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 133. 133. Leviticus chapter 20. Adonai said to Moshe, say to the people of Israel, if someone from the people of Israel or one of the foreigners living in Israel sacrifices one of his children to Molech, he is to be put to death. The people of the land are to stone him to death. I too will set myself against him and cut him off from his people, because he has sacrificed his child to Molech, defiling my sanctuary, profaning my holy name. If the people of the land look the other way, when that man sacrifices his child to Molech and fail to put him to death, then I myself will set myself against him, his family, and everyone who follows him to go fornicating after Molech, and cut them off from their people. The person who turns to spirit mediums, to sorcerers, to go fornicating after them, I will set myself against him and cut him off from his people. Therefore consecrate yourselves. You people must be holy, because I, Adonai, am your God. Observe my regulations and obey them. I am Adonai, who set you apart to be holy. A person who curses his mother or father must be put to death. Having cursed his father or mother, his blood's on him. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, that is, with the wife of a fellow countryman, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. The man who goes to bed with his father's wife has disgraced his father sexually. Both of them must be put to death. Their blood's on them. If a man goes to bed with his daughter-in-law, both must be put to death. They have committed a perversion. Their blood's on them. If a man goes to bed with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They must be put to death. Their blood's on them. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it's depravity. They're to be put to death by fire, both he and they, so there will not be depravity among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he must be put to death, and you're to kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal and has sexual relations with it, you're to kill the woman and the animal. Their blood will be on them. If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter and has sexual relations with her and she consents, it's a shameful thing. They are to be cut off publicly. He has had sexual relations with his sister, and he will bear the consequences of their wrongdoing. If a man goes to bed with a woman in her menstrual period and has sexual relations with her, he has exposed the source of her blood. She has exposed the source of her blood. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. You're not to have sexual relations with your mother's sister, your father's sister. A person who does this has had sexual relations with his close relative. They will bear the consequences of their wrongdoing. If a man goes to bed with his uncle's wife, he has disgraced his uncle sexually. They will bear the consequences of their sin and die childless. If a man takes his brother's wife, it's uncleanness. He has disgraced his brother sexually. They will be childless. You are to observe all my regulations and rulings and act on them, so that the land to which I'm bringing you won't vomit you out. Do not live by the regulations of the nation which I'm expelling ahead of you, because they did all these things, which is why I detested them. But to you I have said, you will inherit their land. I'll give it to you as a possession, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am Adonai your God, who has set you apart from other peoples. Therefore you are to distinguish between clean and unclean animals, between clean and unclean birds. Don't make yourself detestable with an animal, a bird, or a reptile that I've set apart for you to regard as unclean. Rather, you people are to be holy for me, because I, Adonai, am holy. I have set you apart from the other people so that you can belong to me. A man or a woman who is a spirit medium or a sorcerer must be put to death. They're to stone them to death. Their blood will be on them. Now I'm going to focus on some important principles brought up here in chapter 20, because we've already thoroughly studied the meaning of most of these sinful acts discussed in these verses. Now, I'm just probably going to be on my soapbox a little bit more today than usual. That's possible. And the reason is that these principles are so visible in our modern lives. So buckle up. Notice that between the end of verse 1 and the first part of verse 2, we get a solid definition of whom these laws are addressed to. And it is anyone from among the Israelites, including any stranger living among them. It's referring to any citizen of Israel who could be born, who could be a natural-born Hebrew, could be a foreigner who's given up their God in order to worship Jehovah and thereby has formally joined Israel, and it also includes any ger living among Israel. A ger is a foreigner who has not joined himself to Israel, but he is living among Israel presumably for the benefits that this relationship with Israel brings them. I point this out because it is so often said, well, the laws of the Old Testament are just for Israel, meaning, of course, those who are of Hebrew descent. And therefore, nothing of the Old Testament applies to modern Gentile Christians, those not born as Hebrews, or as we say today, Jews. Well, I hope by now I've demonstrated to you that nothing could be further from the truth. But also noting that just as it's not obedience to God's laws that brings us redemption, neither was it for the Israelites. The law is about teaching us what holiness is. It's about teaching us what holiness looks like. What's acceptable to God? What's not acceptable? What is good in God's eyes? What's not? The purpose of the Torah is to show a redeemed person how to live a holy life. It's not to redeem an unredeemed person. And here we find that if someone wants to live among God's people without formally being one of God's people, that's permissible. But they're going to be subject to the same rules and laws of Israeli society as is all the Israelis. And law number 1 is no idolatry. Specifically, no Molech worship. Now, Molech worship was a particular concern to Jehovah because it was practiced by a significant segment of the Canaanites, the current inhabitants of the Promised Land, and by some of the other cultures throughout the known world that the Israelites were going to encounter. Just as important, many people would come to the Promised Land who wanted to join Israel or just stay with Israel for a while for economic reasons, and they were the worshipers of other gods. So it was necessary to lay out the law about this subject because God's laws were to apply throughout God's land. This particular false god, Molech, was especially taboo because his chief attribute was he demanded human blood. Child sacrifice, actually. Now, just as we've already seen, the names of the people in the Bible varied from culture to culture. For instance, Nimrod was a Babylonian name. Asher is that same name, only it's in Assyrian. So we see it with Molech. When we find a god with almost exactly the same attributes, being worshipped by various far-flung cultures, although he goes by different names, we can be fairly certain that it is the same God that's being worshipped. For instance, Ashtaroth, Ishtar, Astarte, and Oster are all the same goddess, the fertility goddess. Just the language of the culture where she's worshipped is different. And by the way, This goddess's name eventually gained another name, an Anglo-Saxon name in a different language that's very familiar to us. Easter. That's right. That's exactly where we got the name for that Christian holiday. Now, Molech was a high deity, a chief god, an El. Because the world's people worshipped many gods, a hierarchy was developed. Gods were put into a pecking order. Some gods were subservient to, or at the very least, less powerful than other gods. A fertility goddess, a god of the rains, a god of the underworld, a god of the harvest. These were lesser gods. So invariably, there had to be a chief god, the god above the other gods, who sat at the top of the hierarchy. And Molech, and all of his various names, he was a chief god. In fact, this concept of one god preeminent over all the others appears in Hebrew culture. The Hebrew El, as in Elohim, El Shaddai, simply means highest God, chief God. So such a term has no meaning if there's no other gods to compare him to. And El, is a language cognate of the Akkadian Il, which also means highest God. And when we see phrases that we mouth in our Bibles, like Lord of Lords, God above all gods, we all say it. King of Kings, we ascribe these to Jehovah, sometimes to Yeshua. These are all just cultural language holdovers from the days of multiple God worship among the Israelites, because we find those terms in the Bible. Yes, in Hebrew and even among the nation of Israel, the thought of there being multiple gods was prevalent during the entire period of the Old Testament on into the time of the New. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more. Now, in Moab, which bordered the Promised Land, the Moabites called Molech Chemosh. In Ammon, which was another bordering nation, the Ammonites called this same god Baal, sometimes Baal Peor, sometimes Baal Zevuv. Anybody know what that means? Lord of the Flies. We first heard Molech's name in Leviticus 18. You find it again now in Leviticus 20. But in one language or another, his name is going to be repeated all throughout the Tanakh, the Old Testament. And we're going to see several terms and phrases about just what it was that Molech demanded of his followers, especially as concerns their children. And we're going to see that terms like handed over, devoted to, offered up. We're going to see a few other terms like that. And at one point it was thought that only one or two of those terms actually indicated the most extreme version of child involvement for Molech. Of course, was killing the child and turning that child over to Molech. The idea was that the other forms of offering children to Molech simply meant that perhaps the child was dedicated to Molech. You know, like we have baby dedications in some churches today. That is, so it was kind of benign. I mean, it was heathen, but it was benign. General agreement now, however, is that all these terms, every one of them, are just various idioms representing the same exact thing. The child is executed. Sometimes the child would become a burnt offering. Perhaps even more often, a child would be killed, buried in the foundation of a new building in order to dedicate that building to Molech, or call for Molech's blessing upon that building or family or activity that took place there. Now, very sadly, Israel's history is replete with bowing down to the false god of this horrendous cult. Israel at times merely accepted the worship of Molech by foreigners living among them, obviously for the sake of tolerance, diversity. But Israel also established the worship of Molech for themselves in various eras. Turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 11. We're going to look at 8 verses. 1 Kings chapter 11. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 382. This is going to surprise some of you. King Shlomo, King Solomon, loved many foreign women besides the daughter of Pharaoh. There were women from the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonites, and the Hittites, nations about which Adonai had said to the people of Israel, "You are not to go among them, or they among you, because they'll turn your hearts away towards their gods." But Solomon was deeply attached to them by his love. He had 700 wives, all princesses, 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon became old, his wives turned his heart away towards other gods, so that he was not wholehearted with Adonai, his God, as David, his father, had been. For Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonites, Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Thus Solomon did what was evil in Adonai's view. He did not fully follow Adonai as David his father had done. Shlomo built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill in front of Jerusalem. Another for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. This is what he did for all of his foreign wives, who then offered and sacrificed to their gods. King Solomon built high places, altars of sacrifice, to serve a whole litany of pagan gods, including Molech. He participated in the worship of a long list of the most detestable false gods. And he allowed his family, he encouraged his people to do the same thing. It's not that he necessarily believed in all these gods, but at least he thought it politically advantageous to show that he had great understanding towards those in his kingdom who didn't believe as he believed. Not only that, he says he did it in love. His motive was love. Now, does that shock you a little bit? It oughta. I mean, I've had more than one angry person come up to me after a class, after a meeting, and say, "I'm so terribly wrong about my teaching that the great King Solomon would worship another god." I mean, how could a Bible hero, who's credited with writing 3 inspired books of the Bible, one of them Proverbs, which is likely the most read of any of the Old Testament scriptures, at least by the church, how could a man of God like this be accused of worshiping other gods? Well, here it is, straightforward in all of its ugly truth. Solomon, the builder of the first temple, worshiped Jehovah, all right, but he also eventually honored other gods, largely, we're told, to satisfy his many foreign wives. Now, just so you understand, the reason Solomon married all those women was to create political alliances. That was the way an alliance with another nation was created in that era. Each wife represented another alliance with another nation. What makes it doubly troubling is that it wasn't as though Solomon began his life as a pagan, and then we have a happy ending of his disavowing those heathen gods and worshiping only the God of Israel. No, he was raised under Levitical law. He knew about all this. The scriptures paint a picture of a man who lapsed in and out of his desire for these other gods. Undoubtedly, he worshiped Jehovah at the same time he was worshiping these false gods, thinking all the time he's doing such a good thing. That's what it means when it says he committed idolatry in love. He was deceiving himself. What he was doing was to try to please others. And can you imagine the image of Solomon worshiping those other gods, making a mockery of everything that Israel stood for, and how that must have hurt and angered and offended those citizens of Israel who had worked so diligently to stay true to the God of Israel? Aren't you glad you don't ever have to witness that? Not so fast. To my dying day, I will never forget the sickening picture of President Bush shortly after 9/11 standing in a mosque in a ceremony transmitted around the world declaring that Allah was good. Allah was God. Allah was the same God as the Christians and the Jews. And that Islam is a valid and true and wonderful, peaceful religion to be favorably compared with the religion of the Bible. After about 20 years, King Solomon did essentially the same thing. And his country fell into civil war and it disintegrated, not to appear again for 3,000 years. Now, I'm not in the business of making predictions. The Lord has never seen fit to tell me of his plans beyond what's there in the scriptures. But explain to me how it is that the elected leader of our nation, who professes on the one hand that Jesus is Lord, can on the other hand say that a false God is also Lord, and there not be any reaction from God. Folks, we've all felt we're on some slippery precipice. And I'm not sure that there can be a much more serious offense against the Lord made on behalf of a nation than the one I just reminded you of. One that most of us witnessed as it happened. This isn't conjecture. I saw it. Many of you saw it. I see all the shaking heads out there. And to top it all off, this nation's leaders are using their power currently to try to dislodge Israel from major portions of their promised land, even from the Temple Mount, and say it's being done in love and for the cause of peace. Most of Christianity's just blown it off as a political leader of a nation being political. And it has nothing to do with anything more than that. That it's okay to call on their nation to join with pagans to worship their God if it's done in the name of love and peace. Well, it wasn't okay when Solomon did it. I don't think it's okay now. I mean, have you ever done something in love that was completely against God's scriptures because you thought it was so compassionate and merciful at the time? And honestly believing that the law of love overrides all of God's commands and ordinances? Even believing that Yeshua, the author of the Word, the Torah, has told us that we're to disregard the very principles he's laid down in the Torah in exchange for moving in whatever directions our hearts lead us. The Bible says following our hearts is typically the wrong thing to do. Jeremiah 17:9 through 10. The heart is more deceitful than anything else and mortally sick. Who can fathom it? I, Adonai, search the heart. I test inner motivations. in order to give everyone what his actions and his conduct deserves. But it eventually got even worse for Israel. Kings Manasseh and then Ammon, kings of Judah in the years leading up to the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, instituted Molech worship under pain of death for all those Israelites who refused to worship him. Even in Yeshua's day, there was an altar in Gehinnom, the valley of Hinnom, that surrounds the eastern and southern edges of the holy city, where Molech was openly worshipped just under the Temple Mount. Children were burned to death in honor of this god. Is it any wonder that God made the promised land vomit Israel out of it on more than one occasion? Is it any wonder that God speaks so passionately against Molech? I mean, I took you on this bit of a detour because I wanted you to understand the unbelievable abomination of tolerating the worship of other gods. How cancerous the cult of Molech was, and that Israel became infected by it to one degree or another at all times because they refused to take the necessary action as prescribed by God to stamp it out. I also took you on this detour because it demonstrates how easy it is to sincerely believe we are worshiping the one true God at the same moment we're blind to the idolatry that is rampant in our own lives because it serves some useful purpose for us. How easy it is for the Church of Jesus Christ to honestly believe that we are true only to him when it is so corrupted by the desire for power and position and money, and not wanting to be ostracized by the world, that there's almost no limits to how far we'll go in order to be inclusive, how far we'll go in order to grow our congregations and to prosper. This is why the word tolerant needs to be eradicated from our vocabulary. Harmony and unity at any price, tolerance and appeasement, these have become virtues in our day. They're not. They're cowardice. They're rebellion. They're sin against the Lord. It's choosing to be against God. But let's be clear. Molech wasn't real. No matter how sincere and how dedicated his believers were, that they would take their toddlers and throw them into a burning fire for the sake of the Molech cult. Molech was just man's evil inclination being led by that wicked Pied Piper, Satan. There's no Molech. Molech is really an ideal, a brainchild of mankind's fallen nature. And the ideal was that if the worshipers of Molech sacrificed some of their children, in return, they'd be blessed with prosperity. Because that was almost always the point of those child sacrifices. I think you know where I'm heading. What kind of pastor would I be if I didn't tell you the truth? For the most part, abortion is just modern-day child sacrifice. Why are the unborn sacrificed? Almost always for our personal well-being and prosperity and comfort. The doctor says, well, maybe there's a defect here. Boy, we better get rid of it because it could be costly, it could be troublesome, it could be heartbreaking. That little blue ring in the bottom of the test tube says there's new life growing in that mother's womb. Oh, but what a burden that would put on our already stretched family budget. Better stop that now. The human secularist and environmentalist sees new human life as a threat to our overpopulated, in their eyes, planet. So in essence, it's the kind and compassionate thing to do, to get rid of it. This is the essence of Molech worship. There's no disguising it. And the penalty for worshiping Molech, or better, the ideal of Molech, as verse 2 of Leviticus 20 says, is death. Not the death of the victim, our death. All those who would commit the act, all those who would tolerate it. Now, verse 3 prescribes stoning as the means of execution for the person among Israel, stranger or citizen, who worships Molech. And further, it says just who is going to do the executing. It's going to be the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, ordinary Israelite citizens. This is not talking about vigilante justice. It's talking about duly appointed people that have been designated for this task. But they weren't the elders. They weren't the tribal leaders. They weren't the chieftains. They weren't the priests. They weren't even members of the court. They were just low-level leaders who had some kind of voice in ordinary community affairs. Why stone these people? Why not shoot them with some arrows, stab them with a knife, cut their heads off? It's hard to know for sure, but most scholarly thought is that those other methods typically required only one or two executioners. Let me tell you something about stoning. It required a lot of people. The idea was of communal participation in the execution, thereby communal acknowledgement of the wrongness of this crime, that they didn't want it among them, so they were actively participating to eradicate it. That's the idea. I agree with that. The idea is, frankly, the execution shouldn't be quick and painless. It ought to be brutal and bloody. It ought to be pretty scary. And from it, Israel should learn that even if their hearts wanted to follow Molech, they're not going to do it for fear of the consequences of it. Then in verse 3 is laid down another principle. Death can be of a twofold nature, physical and spiritual. This is one of those verses that the English kind of misses the mark because it's explaining that even beyond this dual aspect of death, spiritual and physical, there's also the matter that if the people will not do their duty and prosecute a Molech worshiper, the person still doesn't escape because God will cut them off in his way and his time. Now, we've talked about the term cut off, or in Hebrew, karet. And as a reminder, it's really a complex term. It can mean a whole range of things, from dying short of a normal lifespan to being excommunicated from the nation of Israel and therefore from God. It can mean a consequence that comes out in a later generation of that family. It can mean out-and-out execution. It could mean immediate death directly at the hand of God. That happened to Nadav and Abihu, sons of the high priest, Aaron. But underlying it all is that karet, the penalty of being cut off, is divine retribution. Its origination is not from a civil court. We're going to continue in this chapter next week. So if you would please stand.